She was the millionaire's daughter, born unable to move or speak. Doctors called it hopeless. Therapies failed, and everyone believed she would remain trapped in her own body forever. Until one day, a poor black boy wandered into her world, ignored every boundary, did something reckless by the pool, and revealed a truth so devastating it shattered years of medical certainty. What he discovered changed everything. Before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. We love connecting with our global family. Richard DeVoe had spent years living in isolation within his modern mansion at the edge of the city. After losing his wife during childbirth, he withdrew completely from society. His only focus was his daughter Amelia. She was born with what specialists diagnosed as a rare neuromuscular paralysis that left her motionless and silent. Her bright eyes stared without focus, her body never responding to stimuli. Richard had once been a financial powerhouse, building his fortune through determination and brilliance. But when tragedy struck twice, first losing his wife, then watching his daughter's condition remain unchanged, he abandoned his business empire. He transformed his home into a private hospital filled with nurses, specialists, and cutting-edge medical technology. Despite having access to every treatment money could buy, nothing improved Amelia's condition. She remained still, confined to her pink wheelchair, unreachable. Every morning followed the same heartbreaking pattern. Richard would wake before dawn, check on Amelia, and spend hours by her side. He would tell her stories about her mother, describe the gardens outside her window, or simply hold her small, limp hand in silence. Sometimes he sang softly, hoping some fragment of his voice might penetrate her stillness. The medical team had long since prepared him for permanent disappointment, but Richard refused to accept their verdict. He brought in specialists from across the globe, funded experimental treatments, and imported equipment that wasn't yet widely available. He tried everything from traditional medicine to alternative therapies. Still, Amelia's expression never changed. Her world remained one of machines humming, footsteps echoing, and her father's quiet desperation. Richard's wealth could buy comfort, but not connection, or so he believed. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, everything changed. Richard had placed an advertisement for additional household help, someone to maintain the mansion while the medical staff focused on Amelia. He never expected that this simple decision would set in motion events that would challenge everything he believed about his daughter's condition. The woman who answered the ad would bring with her something no amount of money could buy. A small boy whose innocent curiosity would see past the machines, past the diagnosis, and into Amelia's hidden truth. Ruth Williams stood at the imposing gates of the DeVoe mansion, clutching her worn purse with both hands. The iron gates towered above her, intricate and intimidating. She checked her watch, 15 minutes early. Better early than late, her grandmother had always said. Especially when you needed the job as desperately as she did. "Come on, Malik," she whispered, tugging gently at her 8-year-old son's hand. "Remember what we talked about? Best behavior. No running, no shouting, no touching anything." Malik nodded solemnly, his large brown eyes taking in the enormous house beyond the gates. "It looks like a castle, Mama." "And we're not royalty," she reminded him with a nervous smile. "So we act respectful, okay?" The intercom crackled to life. "State your business," a formal voice commanded. "Ruth Williams, sir. I'm here about the housekeeping position." After a pause, The gates swung open silently. Ruth took a deep breath and walked forward, her grip on Malik's hand tightening. She hadn't mentioned bringing her son in the phone interview. Childcare was impossible to afford on her current budget, especially after being laid off from the hospital where she'd worked as a custodian for 5 years. Single mothers didn't have the luxury of options. A tall, thin woman in a crisp uniform met them at the front door. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of Malik. "Mrs. Henderson, head of household staff," she introduced herself curtly. The advertisement didn't mention children. Ruth swallowed hard. "I understand, ma'am. I couldn't arrange childcare today. He's very well behaved, I promise. He won't be any trouble." Mrs. Henderson's lips thinned to a disapproving line. "Mr. DeVoe is very particular about his household. This is primarily a medical facility." "Please," Ruth said quietly. "I can start immediately. I have 5 years of experience in hospital sanitation. I know how to work around medical equipment." The woman hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Come in then. But the boy stays with you at all times." The mansion's interior left Malik breathless. He had never seen ceilings so high or floors so shiny. Everything gleamed: the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the polished wood. But what struck him most was the silence. Their apartment building was always filled with noise: neighbors arguing, music playing, traffic rumbling outside. Here the quiet felt heavy, like a blanket pressing down. While Mrs. Henderson led his mother through a detailed orientation, Malik's attention wandered. He slipped his hand from his mother's grasp and moved a few steps away, drawn to a large window overlooking a garden. Outside, a swimming pool sparkled in the sunlight, its water so blue it looked like something from a movie. "Malik," his mother hissed, noticing his wandering. "Come back here." But Mrs. Henderson was already continuing down the hallway, listing rules and schedules in her clipped tone. Ruth hurried to follow, pulling Malik along. As they moved deeper into the house, Malik noticed something odd. The further they went, the more the mansion resembled a hospital. The warm wood paneling gave way to sterile white walls. Medical equipment lined the corridors. Nurses in uniform passed by, nodding politely but offering no smiles. "The East Wing is strictly off-limits," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "That's where Miss Amelia's primary care happens. You'll be responsible for the common areas, Mr. DeVoe's quarters, and the kitchen facilities." Malik's shoes squeaked on the polished floor. He looked down, suddenly self-conscious of his worn sneakers with their flapping soles. He'd begged his mother not to tape them again this morning. He was 8 now, too old for taped shoes. Now he wished he'd let her fix them. A door stood ajar at the end of the hallway, sunlight streaming through the crack. While his mother was being shown the supply closet, Malik found himself drawn toward that light. It was the first real brightness he'd seen since entering the mansion. Without thinking, he slipped away, his natural curiosity overcoming his mother's warnings. The room beyond was large and airy, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the pool and gardens. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt alive. Plants thrived in corners, and soft music played from hidden speakers. In the center of it all, facing the window, sat a girl in a pink wheelchair. Malik froze in the doorway. The girl didn't move, didn't turn at the sound of his entrance. She appeared to be about his age, maybe a little older, with pale skin and dark hair that fell in perfect waves around her shoulders. She wore a simple white dress, her thin arms resting motionless on the wheelchair's armrests. A blanket covered her legs despite the warm day. Malik had seen people in wheelchairs before. His neighbor, Mr. Johnson, used one after his stroke. But Mr. Johnson was always moving, always talking. This girl was completely still, like a doll someone had placed by the window and forgotten. He should have left. He knew he was breaking rules just by being there. But something about the girl's stillness made him step forward instead of back. "Hi," he said simply, moving into her line of sight. "I'm Malik." No response, not even a blink. Her eyes, a startling blue, stared straight ahead, focused on nothing. Instead of being discouraged, Malik did what came naturally. He sat cross-legged on the floor in front of her wheelchair. From his pocket, he pulled out his most treasured possession, a small metal toy car his father had given him before he died, red with silver wheels, slightly dented, but still perfect in Malik's eyes. "This is Lightning," he explained, rolling the car back and forth on the polished floor. "He's the fastest car in the world. My dad gave him to me." Malik made engine noises, steering the car in elaborate patterns across the floor. He wasn't performing for the girl. He was simply playing as he always did, lost in his imagination, where the little car became a racing champion. "Lightning can go anywhere," he continued, pushing the car up the side of the wheelchair's wheel, then back down. "Over mountains, through tunnels, even underwater if he wants to." As the car completed another circuit near the girl's feet, something extraordinary happened, so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. The girl's eyes, previously fixed on nothing, shifted downward. Just a fraction, just for a moment, but they moved to follow the car's path across the floor. Malik noticed immediately. Unlike the adults who were always looking for grand gestures, dramatic improvements, he saw the tiny change for the miracle it was. He didn't gasp or call for anyone. He simply smiled and rolled the car closer to her feet. "You like lightning?" he asked casually, as if they'd been having a conversation all along. "He likes you too. I can tell." Again, her eyes tracked the movement, this time for a second longer. Nothing else changed. Not her expression, not her posture, but her gaze followed the toy's path before returning to its empty stare. For Malik, it was enough. He continued playing, narrating adventures for Lightning, occasionally glancing up to see if her eyes would move again. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, but he had seen it once, and that was all that mattered. "Malik!" Ruth's panicked voice broke the spell. She stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "What are you doing in here? I told you to stay with me." Behind her loomed Mrs. Henderson, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "This area is strictly off limits," she said coldly. "I made that very clear." Ruth rushed forward, grabbing Malik's arm and pulling him to his feet. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "He wandered off while I was looking at the supply closet. It won't happen again." "Mama, she—" Malik began, but Ruth silenced him with a look. "Not now," she whispered urgently. "We need to go." As Ruth apologized profusely, a tall figure appeared in the doorway, Richard DeVoe himself, imposing in an expensive suit, despite being at home. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "What's happening here?" he asked, his voice quiet but commanding. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "Mr. DeVoe, I apologize for the disturbance. The new housekeeper's son wandered into Miss Amelia's room unauthorized. I was just escorting them out." Richard's gaze fell on Malik, who stood his ground, despite his mother's nervous tugging. Then his eyes moved to his daughter, sitting as always in perfect stillness. "I was just playing with my car," Malik said before anyone could stop him. "I think she likes it." A sad smile touched Richard's lips, the kind adults give children when they say something impossibly naive. "That's very kind of you to think so," he said gently. but Amelia doesn't respond to stimuli. She has a medical condition. But she watched my car, Malik insisted. Her eyes moved. Richard and Mrs. Henderson exchanged a look that Malik recognized. The look grown-ups share when a child says something foolish. But Ruth was studying her son's face carefully. She knew Malik didn't lie, and he wasn't prone to imagination about such specific things. I apologize for my son's intrusion, Ruth said carefully. If you'd prefer we leave. Richard waved a dismissive hand. No need. Children don't understand these situations. To Malik's surprise, he added, as long as he doesn't disturb Amelia's routine or touch any medical equipment, I don't see the harm. Mrs. Henderson looked surprised, but nodded stiffly. As you wish, sir. I'll continue showing Mrs. Williams her duties. As they left the room, Malik glanced back at Amelia. In the shifting sunlight, her face looked different to him, not empty, as the adults believed, but waiting, like the face of someone listening to a story and wondering what happens next. Ruth spent the rest of the afternoon learning her responsibilities, which rooms needed daily cleaning, which weekly, how to work around the medical staff's schedules. Malik sat quietly in corners, drawing with the paper and crayons his mother always carried in her purse, but his thoughts kept returning to the girl in the pink wheelchair. At 5 o'clock, as they prepared to leave, Ruth found herself officially hired. The pay was better than she'd hoped, and Mr. DeVoe had agreed to her bringing Malik after school each day. As long as he remains well-behaved, Mrs. Henderson had added pointedly. On their way out, Malik asked to use the bathroom. Ruth waited in the foyer, reviewing the paperwork Mr. DeVoe had given her. She didn't notice when Malik took a detour. He slipped back into Amelia's room, where she remained by the window, though the sunlight had shifted. A nurse was adjusting something on a monitor nearby, but paid him no attention. Malik approached the wheelchair quietly and knelt beside it. He placed his treasured toy car on Amelia's lap, tucking it gently under her limp hand. Lightning wants to stay with you tonight, he whispered. I'll come back for him tomorrow. Maybe you can think of adventures for him while I'm gone. He studied her face carefully, looking for any sign she had heard him. For just a moment, so brief he might have imagined it, her fingers seemed to twitch against the metal car. Malik, his mother's voice called from the hallway. We need to go. He stood quickly. See you tomorrow, he promised, then ran to join his mother, unaware that he had just changed the course of Amelia's life forever. Behind him, in the quiet room, Amelia's eyes slowly, almost imperceptibly, lowered to look at the small red car resting in her palm. The first voluntary movement she had made in years. The next afternoon, Malik burst into Amelia's room with the energy of a small hurricane. School had ended, and Ruth had brought him straight to the mansion for her afternoon shift. This time, Richard had left specific instructions. Malik was permitted in Amelia's room as long as a nurse was present. I'm back, he announced, dropping his backpack by the door. Did you miss me? Amelia sat in her wheelchair, positioned by the window as always. The small red car was nowhere to be seen, likely removed by one of the nurses who wouldn't have understood its significance. Malik didn't seem bothered. He approached her with the easy confidence of someone greeting an old friend. I brought something new today, he said, pulling a book from his backpack. It's about dinosaurs. My teacher says they were bigger than houses. He settled cross-legged on the floor beside her wheelchair and began to read, holding the book up so she could see the colorful illustrations. His voice filled the sterile room with warmth as he described Tyrannosaurus rexes and Triceratops, adding his own sound effects for their roars and movements. The nurse on duty, a young woman named Sarah, watched from the corner, initially vigilant but gradually relaxing as she saw how gentle the boy was. Unlike the specialists who came with their tests and charts, Malik spoke to Amelia as if she could understand every word. There was no clinical detachment, no careful management of expectations. Just a boy sharing his day with a friend. This pattern continued day after day. Malik would finish school, arrive at the mansion with his mother, and make a beeline for Amelia's room. Each time, he brought something new. A pine cone found on the sidewalk, a paper airplane he'd made in class, a caterpillar in a jar that he'd rescued from the playground. "This is Mr. Fuzzy," he explained, holding up the jar with the caterpillar. "He's going to turn into a butterfly. My teacher says it's called meta something." "Metamorphosis," Sarah supplied from her post by the monitors. "Yeah, that. It means he's going to completely change. Isn't that cool, Amelia? He goes into a cocoon and comes out totally different." By the second week, Malik had established a routine. He would tell Amelia about his day at school, read her a story or show her his treasures, and then simply play nearby, keeping up a steady stream of chatter. Sometimes he'd sing songs he learned in music class, off-key, but enthusiastic. Other times, he'd build elaborate structures with blocks he'd brought from home, narrating his architectural plans as if Amelia were his client. The mansion that had been shrouded in silence for years now echoed with the sound of a child's laughter. Ruth noticed the change in the mansion's atmosphere almost immediately. As she moved through the halls with her cleaning cart, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done since her husband died. The oppressive silence that had first struck her was lifting, like morning fog burned away by sunlight. One afternoon, as she polished the antique table in the main hallway, Richard DeVoe emerged from his study. He looked tired as always, but something was different in his posture, a slight easing of the rigid control he usually maintained. "Mrs. Williams," he acknowledged with a nod. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you, sir," she replied, surprised by the personal question. Richard hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Your son. He spends considerable time with Amelia." Ruth tensed, preparing for criticism. "Yes, sir, if that's a problem." "No," Richard interrupted, his voice softer than she'd heard before. "I'm simply curious. The nurses tell me he talks to her as if she can understand him." Ruth relaxed slightly. "Malik has always been that way, sir. He doesn't see limitations the way adults do. To him, everyone deserves a friend." Richard's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a longing so profound it made Ruth's heart ache. "The specialists have always been clear about Amelia's condition," he said, more to himself than to Ruth. "There's no evidence of awareness or comprehension. Children often see things we don't," Ruth offered carefully. "My Malik, he notices small things, details." Richard nodded absently, then straightened his shoulders, the brief moment of vulnerability gone. "Well, as long as he's supervised and doesn't interfere with her medical care, I see no harm in his visits." As he walked away, Ruth realized what had been different. Richard DeVoe had spoken about his daughter without that edge of despair that had colored his voice before. It wasn't hope, not yet, but perhaps the first step toward it. In the nurses' station, a quiet revolution was brewing. It began with Sarah, who had spent the most time observing Malik and Amelia together. "I swear her heart rate changes when he enters the room," she told Lisa, the head nurse, one evening during shift change. "The monitor shows a slight increase, nothing dramatic but consistent." Lisa, who had been caring for Amelia for 3 years, was skeptical. Coincidence. We've seen anomalies before. It's not just that, Sarah insisted, lowering her voice, though they were alone. Yesterday, when he was reading to her, I think her eyes were tracking the pictures in the book. Not constantly, but in moments. That's impossible, Lisa said automatically, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. The neurological tests have always been conclusive. The conversation might have ended there, but then Maria, who handled the night shift, joined in. I found something strange last night, she said, glancing toward the hallway to ensure they weren't overheard. A toy car under her blanket. I almost threw it away, but then I noticed. Her fingers were curled around it. Not just resting on it, actually holding it. The three women exchanged looks. They had all been trained to follow the science, to trust the diagnosis, to manage their emotions. But they had also been trained to observe changes, no matter how small. We should document this, Lisa finally said, her professional caution warring with a growing sense that something extraordinary might be happening. But discreetly. No need to raise false hopes. By the end of the third week, whispers had spread throughout the medical staff. No one wanted to be the first to officially challenge years of medical consensus. But in private conversations, questions multiplied. Was it possible they had all missed something? Could the simple presence of a child accomplish what millions of dollars in medical intervention had not? The changes in Amelia were so subtle that they might have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't watching as carefully as Malik. But he saw everything. The slight twitch of her fingers when he placed a smooth stone in her palm. The way her breathing changed rhythm when he sang certain songs. The momentary focus in her eyes when he moved suddenly. One rainy afternoon, Malik brought a kaleidoscope he'd received for his birthday. The nurses had dimmed the lights to reduce glare on Amelia's monitors, creating a cocoon of soft shadows in the room. Look at this, he said, holding the kaleidoscope up to her eye. It makes patterns with light. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, Amelia's pupil dilated as it adjusted to the shifting colors. When Malik moved the kaleidoscope away, her eye followed it, just for a fraction of a second, but unmistakably. You see it, he exclaimed, his face lighting up. I knew you could. Another day, he brought his portable radio and played different types of music, watching her reactions closely. Classical music produced no visible response, nor did the pop songs his mother liked. But when a jazz saxophone solo filled the room, Amelia's index finger tapped once against the armrest of her wheelchair, a tiny movement, barely there, but rhythmic and deliberate. Malik noticed it immediately. You like this one, he said, turning the volume up slightly. My dad liked jazz too. He said it was like a conversation without words. The finger tapped again, and Malik grinned as if they were sharing a secret. Most significant were the moments when he would simply sit beside her wheelchair, talking about his dreams and fears in a way he never did with adults. He told her about the kids who teased him at school, about how he missed his father, about how he wanted to be an astronaut someday. I bet you have dreams too, he said softly one afternoon. Maybe you can't tell anybody, but they're still there. As he spoke, a single tear formed in the corner of Amelia's eye and slowly tracked down her cheek. The first tear anyone had seen her shed since infancy. The mansion itself seemed to respond to Malik's presence, as if the building were also awakening from a long slumber. Sunlight that had once been carefully filtered through heavy curtains now streamed freely through windows that Ruth had been instructed to leave uncovered. The harsh antiseptic smell that had permeated the halls began to mingle with the scent of fresh flowers that Malik brought from a neighbor's garden and placed in a cup by Amelia's bed. One particularly beautiful morning, Sarah wheeled Amelia's chair onto the patio for the first time in months. Malik had been insistent. The day was too perfect to spend indoors. As dappled sunlight played across Amelia's face, her skin seemed to glow with newfound color. A breeze stirred her hair, and for a moment, with her eyes closed and her face tilted toward the warmth, she looked simply like a girl, enjoying the sunshine. "See," Malik said to Sarah. "She likes being outside." Sarah couldn't argue. The monitors showed Amelia's vitals were stronger than they'd been in weeks. The most profound transformation, however, was in the sound of the house. Where silence had reigned, there was now Malik's laughter echoing through the halls, his footsteps racing across marble floors, his voice rising and falling as he told Amelia elaborate stories. Music played more frequently, jazz for Amelia, children's songs that Malik insisted on singing along with, even the classical pieces that Richard had always preferred, but had stopped playing after his wife's death. One evening, as Ruth finished her shift, she paused outside the music room. The door was ajar, and through the crack, she could see Richard sitting at the grand piano that had gathered dust for years. His fingers moved hesitantly over the keys, picking out a simple melody, a lullaby, the same one, Ruth realized, that Malik had been singing to Amelia that afternoon. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 month after Malik's first visit. Richard had been reviewing medical reports in his study when he heard an unfamiliar sound, Malik's voice, raised in excitement rather than his usual conversational tone. "Mr. DeVoe, come quick." Richard's heart seized with the immediate fear that something had gone wrong. He rushed from his study, down the hall to Amelia's room, expecting to find a medical crisis unfolding. Instead, he found Malik standing beside Amelia's wheelchair, his face alight with joy. "Watch," the boy said simply, pointing to Amelia. Richard had learned to manage his expectations over the years. Too many specialists had promised breakthroughs that never materialized. Too many treatments had raised hopes only to dash them. He had trained himself not to hope, not to look for miracles, but something in Malik's certainty made him pause. "What am I looking for?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Malik didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a bright red ball from the floor and held it about 2 feet in front of Amelia's face. "Amelia," he said clearly, "follow the ball." Richard opened his mouth to gently explain, once again, that Amelia couldn't follow commands, that her condition prevented such voluntary movement, but the words died in his throat as he watched his daughter's eyes, her clear blue eyes that had stared blankly for so many years, deliberately track the ball as Malik moved it slowly from left to right. It wasn't a reflexive movement. It wasn't a coincidence. It was purposeful, conscious tracking. "Now watch this," Malik said, encouraged by Richard's stunned silence. He placed the ball in Amelia's lap and covered her hand with his own. "Squeeze the ball, Amelia. Just a little squeeze." Seconds passed. Richard held his breath. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, Amelia's fingers curled inward, applying the faintest pressure against the ball. Richard fell to his knees in front of his daughter's wheelchair, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. "Amelia," he whispered, taking her other hand in his. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then Amelia's fingers twitched against his palm. Not a spasm, not a reflex, but a response, a connection. "She's been trying to talk to you," Malik said simply, as if explaining something obvious. "She just needed to remember how." Richard looked up at the small boy who had accomplished what an army of specialists could not. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice breaking. Malik shrugged, the gesture endearingly childlike in its simplicity. "I just talked to her like she could hear me. Everyone else talks about her like she's not there." In that moment, as Richard felt his daughter's fingers move against his for the first time in years, the fortress of grief and resignation he had built around his heart began to crumble. The sensation that flooded in wasn't quite hope. It was too raw, too overwhelming for such a simple word. It was life itself, returning to a place that had been preserved in amber for too long. "Get Dr. Winters on the phone," he said to Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway. Tell him Amelia is waking up." July arrived with a heat wave that settled over the city like a heavy blanket. The DeVoe mansion, typically cool and controlled in its environment, surrendered to summer's persistence. Even with air conditioning running constantly, the house felt different, warmer, more alive. It was on one of these scorching afternoons that Sarah suggested moving Amelia to the pool area. "The breeze is better there," she explained to Richard, who had become increasingly receptive to changes in his daughter's routine. And Malik could use the shade of the pergola for their reading time. Richard agreed, his eyes lingering on Amelia's face. In the 2 months since Malik had first entered their lives, subtle but undeniable changes had occurred. Amelia's eyes tracked movement more consistently now. Her fingers responded to touch. Once Richard could have sworn he heard a soft hum when Malik sang her favorite song. Dr. Winters remained cautious in his assessment, speaking of increased neural responsiveness and potential for limited recovery. But Richard had begun to hope for the first time in years. That afternoon, Malik arrived wearing swim trunks and carrying a plastic bag filled with pool toys, colorful rings, a small inflatable ball, and a rubber duck, wearing sunglasses that made Amelia's lips twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Mom said I could swim after I read to Amelia," he explained to Sarah, who was adjusting Amelia's wide-brimmed sun hat. "Is that okay?" "As long as I'm here to watch you," Sarah replied, though her attention was divided between Amelia's monitors and the medication schedule she was reviewing. The pool area was a masterpiece of luxury, azure water shimmering in the sunlight, surrounded by natural stone tiles and lush potted palms. A pergola draped with wisteria provided shade for Amelia's wheelchair, positioned carefully several feet from the water's edge. The safety gate that normally secured the pool had been left open to accommodate their entry. Malik sat cross-legged on a cushioned lounger beside Amelia and began reading from The Little Prince, one of the books Richard had suggested from his late wife's collection. The story of a boy from another planet seemed to captivate Amelia in ways other books didn't. Her eyes remained fixed on Malik's face as he read, occasionally glancing at the illustrations he held up for her to see. "What makes the desert beautiful," said the little prince, "is that somewhere it hides a well." Malik read carefully, pronouncing the difficult words with determination. He looked up at Amelia. "That means there's always something special hidden where you don't expect it, like how you're hidden inside yourself, but I can see you." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's phone rang. She stepped away to take the call, Dr. Winters with questions about Amelia's latest readings. "I'll just be a minute," she said, walking toward the house, where reception was better. "Stay away from the water until I'm back, Malik." Malik nodded, but his attention had already shifted. He'd noticed something unusual. Amelia wasn't looking at him anymore. For the first time since he'd known her, her gaze was fixed intently on something else. The pool. Her blue eyes tracked the rippling patterns of light dancing across the water's surface, following the gentle movements with an intensity he'd never seen before. "You like the water?" he asked, moving to follow her line of sight. Amelia's eyes remained locked on the pool. A slight breeze stirred the surface, creating hypnotic patterns of light and shadow. The sun reflected off the water in diamond-like sparkles that seemed to fascinate her. Malik closed the book and studied her face carefully. There was something different in her expression, not just awareness, but longing. He'd seen that look before, on his own face in the mirror, when he passed the bakery window with empty pockets. "Do you want to get closer?" he asked. The slightest change in her breathing was his only answer, but to Malik, it was enough. The mansion had fallen into an unusual quiet. Inside, Richard was on an important conference call with specialists from Europe, the first time he'd engaged with his business in months. Ruth was cleaning the east wing, far from the pool area. The gardeners had the day off due to the heat. Even the birds seemed to have retreated to shadier spots, leaving the pool area in a bubble of silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against tile. Malik looked toward the house. Sarah was still on her call, pacing in the shade of the veranda, her back to them. He knew he should wait. He knew the rules about Amelia's wheelchair, about the pool, about supervision. But something stronger than rules pulled at him. The same instinct that had made him speak to Amelia when everyone else had given up. The same certainty that had guided him to leave his toy car in her hand that first day. Time seemed to slow down. The air grew thick with possibility. Malik felt as if he and Amelia were suspended in a moment separate from the rest of the world, a moment where the usual boundaries didn't apply. "I think you need to feel it," he said softly, his decision made. "Don't worry, I won't let anything bad happen." He moved behind her wheelchair, his small hands gripping the handles with determination. The chair was heavier than he expected, but he managed to unlock the brakes with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. Slowly, he pushed the wheelchair toward the pool's edge. The stone tiles were smooth beneath the wheels, allowing him to move her with surprising ease. Amelia's breathing quickened slightly, the only sign of her awareness of what was happening. "The water feels really good," Malik explained as they approached the edge. "It's like being wrapped in a warm blanket, but you can move in it. I think you want to move, don't you?" They reached the pool's edge. Malik positioned the wheelchair so that Amelia could see directly into the clear blue depths. Her reflection wavered on the surface. A pale face framed by dark hair, eyes wide and alert in a way they rarely were. What happened next would later be described a dozen different ways by those who witnessed the aftermath. Some would call it reckless, others miraculous. Richard would eventually come to see it as the moment that saved his daughter's life. With a deep breath and absolute conviction, Malik tilted the wheelchair forward. "Time to swim," he whispered. The splash was enormous, a great eruption of water and sound that shattered the afternoon stillness. The wheelchair tipped forward, and Amelia slid from it into the pool, her white dress billowing around her like a jellyfish as she sank beneath the surface. The wheelchair itself teetered on the edge for a heart-stopping moment, before falling in after her with a secondary splash, sinking quickly to the bottom of the deep end. The sound pierced the mansion's quiet, like a thunderclap. Sarah dropped her phone mid-conversation, whirling to see the empty space where Amelia's wheelchair had been, and Malik standing at the pool's edge. "Oh my God!" she screamed, running toward the pool. "Help! Somebody help!" Ruth was the first to respond, emerging from the house at a run. When she saw what had happened, the empty space, her son standing by the water's edge, the dark shape of the wheelchair visible at the bottom of the pool, her heart stopped. "Malik!" she screamed, terror making her voice unrecognizable. "What have you done?" Richard burst through the French doors seconds later, his face ashen. He had been on a video call in his study when he heard the screams. He took in the scene in an instant. The missing wheelchair, the rippling water, his daughter, nowhere in sight. "Amelia." The sound that tore from his throat was primal, a father's desperate cry. He ran toward the pool, stripping off his suit jacket as he moved, preparing to dive in. But Malik's voice stopped him. "Wait!" the boy called, pointing to the water. "Look!" Beneath the surface, something extraordinary was happening. Amelia hadn't sunk to the bottom as expected. Instead, she was suspended in the water, her white dress flowing around her like wings. And then, impossibly, miraculously, her arms moved. Not the twitches or reflexive movements they had documented in recent weeks. These were deliberate, purposeful motions. Her arms extended outward, then pulled inward in a primitive swimming motion. Her legs, which had never shown any voluntary movement, kicked weakly but definitely against the water. Richard froze at the edge of the pool, unable to process what he was seeing. Amelia's face broke the surface, and she gasped, a sharp, sudden intake of breath, followed by something that sounded almost like a cry. Water streamed from her hair, her eyes wide open and fully alert for perhaps the first time in her life. Her arms continued to move, not with strength or coordination, but with unmistakable intention. She wasn't drowning. She was swimming, or at least attempting to. "She's moving," Sarah whispered, her professional composure shattered by disbelief. "She's actually moving." Ruth's hands covered her mouth, her anger at Malik forgotten in the face of the impossible scene unfolding before them. Amelia's lips parted, and a sound emerged. Not words, but a vocalization that was neither pain nor distress. It was the sound of effort, of determination, of life asserting itself after years of silence. Without hesitation, Malik jumped into the pool, fully clothed. He swam to Amelia's side with the confident strokes of a child who had spent summers at the public pool. When he reached her, he slipped an arm around her waist, supporting her as she continued her tentative movements. "You're doing it," he exclaimed, his face alight with joy rather than fear. "I knew you could. You're swimming, Amelia." Richard finally broke from his paralysis. He dove into the pool, his expensive clothes forgotten, and reached his daughter in powerful strokes. But when he got there, he didn't immediately pull her from the water, as everyone expected. Instead, he hovered nearby, watching in awe as she continued to move with Malik's support. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down his face, indistinguishable from the pool water. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Amelia's eyes found her father's face. Recognition flickered there, not the vacant stare they had grown accustomed to, but true awareness. Her lips trembled, and another sound emerged, this one softer, almost like a word trying to form. Richard reached out a trembling hand to touch her cheek. "I'm here," he said. "I've always been here." Malik beamed at them both. "She wanted the water," he explained simply. "She kept looking at it. I think she remembered something." Richard nodded, unable to speak through his tears. He gently took over supporting Amelia from Malik, cradling his daughter in the water as her arms continued their weak but deliberate movements. "You're okay," Malik said to Amelia, echoing Richard's words from moments before. "You're okay now." Richard dropped to his knees in the shallow end, still holding Amelia as the water lapped around them. She was soaking wet, her dark hair plastered to her face, her white dress clinging to her thin frame, and she was more alive than he had seen her in years. Later, when the ambulance had come and gone, when Amelia had been examined by astonished doctors, when the mansion had filled with specialists and consultants, all talking over each other in excited tones, Richard found himself sitting alone in his study, trying to make sense of what had happened. The medical explanations began immediately. Words like aquatic therapy and sensory stimulation and neuroplasticity filled the air. There were discussions of water's unique properties, how it supported limbs and reduced the effort needed for movement, how it might have triggered dormant neural pathways. But none of these clinical terms captured the truth of what Richard had witnessed. His daughter, who had been diagnosed with complete neuromuscular paralysis, had moved her arms and legs with purpose. His daughter, who had never made a sound beyond involuntary reflexes, had vocalized. His daughter, who had been declared permanently non-responsive by the world's leading specialists, had looked at him with recognition. Ruth found him there, staring at nothing. She hesitated in the doorway, still shaken by the day's events. "Mr. DeVoe," she began, "I don't know what to say about what Malik did. It was dangerous, reckless. It was a miracle," Richard interrupted softly. "Or perhaps the revelation of a truth we've all been too blind to see." "What truth?" Ruth asked. Richard looked up at her, his eyes both haunted and hopeful. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." In Amelia's room, now filled with monitoring equipment and attended by a rotation of amazed medical staff, Malik sat beside her bed, holding her hand. Her eyes were closed in exhaustion, but her fingers curled weakly around his, a gesture that would have been impossible just hours before. "I told you the water would feel good," he whispered to her sleeping form. "Tomorrow, maybe we can try again." Outside the window, the pool glimmered in the fading light, its surface calm and innocent, giving no hint of the transformation it had witnessed, or the mysteries it had yet to reveal. The story broke on local news first. Millionaire's paralyzed daughter shows miraculous recovery. By morning, national outlets had picked it up. Within 48 hours, satellite trucks lined the private road leading to the DeVoe mansion, reporters jostling for position, hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle girl or the boy who had caused the sensation. Inside St. Mary's Hospital, where Amelia had been transferred for comprehensive evaluation, a different kind of frenzy unfolded. Specialists from neurology, physical medicine, developmental pediatrics, and a half-dozen other departments cycled through her private suite. They arrived with skepticism and left with bewilderment. The girl who had been diagnosed with total neuromuscular paralysis was now moving her limbs, tracking objects with her eyes, and responding to stimuli in ways that defied her medical history. Richard barely left her side. He slept in a chair beside her bed, his normally immaculate appearance giving way to stubble and rumpled clothes. He fielded calls from colleagues, declined interview requests, and focused entirely on the battery of tests being performed on his daughter. Dr. Winters, who had overseen Amelia's care for years, appeared shell-shocked. He had built his reputation on complex neurological cases, had published papers citing Amelia's condition as a textbook example of complete neuromuscular paralysis. Now he found himself reviewing her case with a team of specialists who questioned his every decision. "Mr. DeVoe," he said on the third day, entering Amelia's room with a thick folder of test results. "We need to talk." Richard looked up, noting the gravity in the doctor's expression. "What is it?" "Perhaps we should speak privately," Dr. Winters suggested, glancing at Malik, who had been allowed to visit and was sitting cross-legged on the foot of Amelia's bed, showing her pictures in a marine lifebook. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of him," Richard replied firmly. "He's the reason we're here." Dr. Guy Winters nodded stiffly and pulled up a chair. "We've completed the comprehensive neurological workup, including the new imaging and the medication clearance you requested." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "The results are unexpected." "Unexpected how?" Richard pressed, leaning forward. Dr. Winters cleared his throat. "The new imaging shows neural pathways that were previously undetected, and the blood work since we've reduced her medication regimen shows significant changes in her neurochemistry." "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that Amelia's condition appears to have been significantly exacerbated by her medication protocol." Dr. Winters looked down at his hands. "The combination of sedatives, anti-seizure medications, and muscle relaxants we've been administering may have been suppressing her neurological function rather than supporting it." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "Are you telling me my daughter was never completely paralyzed?" "Not in the way we thought," Dr. Winters admitted. "She likely has a form of sensory processing disorder combined with muscular weakness, but the profound immobility and non-responsiveness appear to have been largely iatrogenic, caused by the very treatments meant to help her." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "The new team believes she may have been trapped in a state of chemical sedation that mimicked complete paralysis," Dr. Winters continued, his professional demeanor cracking under Richard's intense gaze. "The water immersion somehow broke through that. Perhaps the sensory stimulation, combined with the buoyancy, allowed her to access motor functions that have been dormant, but not destroyed." "You're saying we've been drugging her into silence for years," Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's what you're telling me." Dr. Winters winced. "It was never intentional, Mr. DeVoe. We were following established protocols for what we believed was her condition." "And what exactly is her condition now?" Richard demanded. "We believe she has a form of sensory integration disorder with associated motor difficulties. Significant, yes, but treatable. With proper therapy and continued medication adjustment, she could potentially regain substantial function." Malik, who had been listening intently, looked up from his book. "That means she can get better, right?" Dr. Winters nodded, seeming grateful for the boy's straightforward question. "Yes, she can get better." That night, after Malik had gone home with Ruth and Amelia had fallen asleep, Richard stood at the window of the hospital room, staring out at the city lights. The revelation had hollowed him out, leaving a void filled with a sickening mixture of rage and guilt. For years, he had trusted the specialists, deferred to their expertise, spared no expense in following their recommendations. He had believed he was doing everything possible for his daughter. Instead, he had been complicit in her imprisonment, a chemical cage that had kept her trapped inside her own body. He thought of all the birthdays spent beside her unresponsive form, all the stories read to seemingly unseeing eyes, all the times he had mourned her as if she were already gone, while she was right there, perhaps aware, perhaps screaming silently for someone to notice. A nurse entered to check Amelia's vitals, moving quietly in the dim light. "She's doing well," she whispered to Richard. "Her readings are more stable every day." When the nurse left, Richard moved to his daughter's bedside. In sleep, with the harsh hospital lighting softened, she looked so much like her mother that it made his chest ache. He gently took her hand, remembering how just days ago such a gesture had seemed futile. a father's ritual without hope of response. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Amelia. I should have questioned more. I should have looked harder. I should have found you sooner." To his shock, her fingers tightened slightly around his, a deliberate squeeze that sent tears streaming down his face. Even in sleep, she was reaching back to him now, bridging the gulf that had separated them for so long. Richard dropped his head onto their joined hands and wept, for the years lost, for the suffering she had endured, and for the miracle that had come not from medical science or his millions, but from a barefoot boy who had seen what all the experts had missed. The following morning, Ruth arrived with Malik to find Richard in the hospital corridor, engaged in a heated discussion with his legal team. She caught fragments about malpractice and settlements as she guided Malik past them toward Amelia's room. Later, as Malik sat with Amelia, showing her how to use the controls on her hospital bed, Ruth found Richard alone in the small waiting area, surrounded by documents. "Mr. DeVoe," she said quietly, "may I speak with you?" He looked up, distracted. "Of course, Mrs. Williams. Is everything all right with Malik?" "Malik is fine." She sat across from him, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. "It's you I'm concerned about." Richard blinked, surprised by her directness. In the months she had worked for him, Ruth had always maintained a respectful distance. This was different. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing," he replied stiffly. "Are you?" Ruth's eyes were kind but unflinching. "Because it looks to me like you're preparing for war when you should be focusing on healing." Richard's expression hardened. "These doctors stole years from my daughter's life. They need to be held accountable." "I agree," Ruth said simply. "But right now, your daughter needs her father more than she needs an avenger." "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Ruth interrupted gently. "When my husband died, I wanted someone to blame. The drunk driver who hit him was already dead too, so I had nowhere to direct my anger. I spent months looking for someone to sue, someone to punish. Meanwhile, Malik was grieving alone because his mother was too busy fighting ghosts to help him heal." Richard fell silent, struck by the quiet authority in her voice. "You can hide behind your wealth and your lawyers," Ruth continued. "You can spend the next 5 years in courtrooms and depositions, or you can be present for the miracle that's happening right now in that hospital room." "It's not that simple," Richard protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "It never is," Ruth agreed. "But ask yourself this. What would Amelia choose? More years lost to your quest for justice, or a father fully present for her rebirth?" The question hung between them, unanswered, but impossible to ignore. Ruth stood, smoothing her simple dress. "Malik and I will be with Amelia if you need us," she said, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and the weight of her words. When Richard returned to Amelia's room an hour later, he found Malik sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a small red rubber ball, one of several toys the physical therapists had brought to assess Amelia's motor skills. "Mr. DeVoe," Malik exclaimed, "watch what we're doing." Richard approached cautiously. Amelia was propped up against her pillows, her eyes more alert than he had ever seen them. The reduction in her medications had produced visible changes. Her gaze was clearer, her movements more purposeful, though still limited. "Amelia's practicing her grip," Malik explained, placing the ball in her palm. "The therapist lady said it's important." Richard watched as his daughter's fingers slowly curled around the ball. The movement was labored, imperfect, but undeniably intentional. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Malik beamed. Now we're working on catch. I roll it to her, and she tries to stop it. He demonstrated, gently rolling the ball across the blanket toward Amelia's hand. Her fingers twitched, attempting to trap it, though the ball rolled past. Almost, Malik encouraged. Let's try again. As they continued their game, Richard noticed something extraordinary. Amelia's lips were moving slightly, as if she were trying to form words. The speech therapist had mentioned this might happen as the medication cleared her system, but had cautioned it could be weeks or months before actual vocalization occurred. Malik rolled the ball again. This time, Amelia's hand moved more decisively, managing to trap the ball against her side. Her face lit up with an expression Richard had never seen before. Pride. You did it! Malik cheered. You caught the ball! Amelia's lips moved again, more deliberately this time. A sound emerged, breathy, barely audible, but distinct. Richard froze, afraid to believe what he was hearing. B. The sound came again, Amelia's face contorting with effort. Bah. Malik leaned closer. Are you trying to say ball? He asked. Amelia's eyes locked onto his, intense with concentration. B. All, she whispered, the word fragmenting but unmistakable. Ball, Malik repeated, holding it up. You said ball. Richard stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the bed. Amelia, he whispered, did you just speak? Her eyes shifted to her father, recognition and something more complex, perhaps forgiveness, shining in their depths. Ball, she said again, the word slightly clearer this time. It was just one syllable, just a simple noun, but to Richard, it was everything. The first word from his daughter's lips in years, the breaking of a silence he had thought would last forever. By the end of the week, Amelia's story had captivated the nation. Medical journals requested case studies, talk shows sought exclusive interviews, and parents of children with similar diagnoses flooded the hospital with calls and emails, desperate for information. Richard, who had spent years shielding Amelia from public view, now faced a difficult decision. His instinct was to protect her privacy, to keep her recovery within the safe confines of their private world. But Ruth's words had taken root in his mind, forcing him to consider a different path. On the day of Amelia's discharge from the hospital, Richard called a press conference, not in the hospital's media room as the administration had suggested, but in the garden courtyard, where Amelia could feel the sun on her face. Reporters gathered, cameras ready, as Richard wheeled Amelia to the small podium that had been set up. She wore a simple blue dress instead of a hospital gown, her hair pulled back with a ribbon. Malik stood beside her wheelchair, his hand resting protectively on its arm. Ruth waited nearby, a quiet presence of support. Thank you all for coming, Richard began, his voice steady despite his nerves. As you know, my daughter Amelia has experienced what many are calling a miraculous recovery. But what happened wasn't a miracle. It was the revelation of a truth that had been hidden for too long. He looked down at Amelia, who gazed back at him with clear eyes. For years, Amelia was misdiagnosed and overmedicated. The treatments meant to help her actually imprisoned her in a state of artificial paralysis. It took the courage and intuition of a child. He gestured to Malik, who smiled shyly. To see what all the specialists missed, that my daughter was always there, always aware, just waiting for someone to truly see her. Cameras flashed as Richard continued. I could focus on blame. I could pursue legal action against those responsible. But that would only waste more precious time. Time that Amelia has already lost too much of. He straightened his shoulders, his decision made. Instead, I am establishing the Amelia DeVoe Foundation for Diagnostic Reform. We will fund research, education, and advocacy to ensure that no other child suffers as Amelia did. We will work to reform the protocols that prioritize medication over observation, that value clinical detachment over human connection. A reporter called out, "Mr. DeVoe, how do you respond to Dr. B. Winter's statement that the medical team followed established protocols?" Richard's expression hardened briefly, then softened as he felt Amelia's hand touch his. "Established protocols failed my daughter," he replied simply. "It's time to establish better ones." That evening, as the media frenzy subsided and the mansion fell quiet once more, Richard found himself in Amelia's room. Not the sterile medical space it had once been, but a room transformed. The hospital equipment had been minimized, replaced with colorful therapy tools, books, and toys. The windows stood open, letting in the summer breeze and the sounds of the garden. Amelia sat in her new wheelchair, lighter, more maneuverable, designed for someone expected to gain independence rather than remain passive. She was tired from the day's events but alert, her eyes following her father as he moved around the room. A soft knock at the door announced Ruth and Malik's arrival. "We just came to say goodnight," Ruth explained, her hand on Malik's shoulder. "Actually," Richard said, "I was hoping to speak with both of you." Ruth nodded, guiding Malik into the room. The boy immediately went to Amelia, showing her a small seashell he'd brought. "For your collection," he explained. "When you can go to the beach yourself, you can find more." Richard watched their interaction. The easy way Malik spoke to Amelia, the light in her eyes when she saw him, the gentle confidence with which he included her in his world. There was no pity in his approach, no careful distance, just the natural connection of two children who had somehow found each other across seemingly insurmountable barriers. "Mrs. Williams, Ruth," Richard began, "these past weeks have changed everything I thought I knew about Amelia's condition, about what she needs to thrive." Ruth nodded, waiting for him to continue. "The medical team has outlined an intensive therapy program, physical, occupational, speech. They believe with consistent work, Amelia could regain significant function." He hesitated, then pressed on. "But I've come to understand that medical intervention is only part of what she needs. Perhaps not even the most important part." "She needs connection," Ruth said softly. "She needs to be seen as a person, not a patient." "Yes," Richard agreed, "and no one has seen her more clearly than your son." Malik looked up at the mention of himself, momentarily distracted from showing Amelia how the ridges on the seashell felt against her palm. "I'd like to offer you both a more permanent position here," Richard continued. "Not as staff, but as—" he struggled to find the right words. "As family, of a sort. Malik has been the key to Amelia's awakening. I believe he will be essential to her continued progress." Ruth's eyes widened. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. DeVoe?" "The East Wing has a complete apartment, originally designed for my wife's parents, though they never used it. I'd like you and Malik to move in. You would have privacy, independence, but be here where Malik and Amelia could continue their friendship. You would be compensated, of course, but this would be about more than employment." Ruth was silent for a long moment, considering. "And what would my role be exactly?" Whatever you want it to be, Richard answered honestly. I've learned the hard way that I don't have all the answers. But I know that Amelia smiles when Malik enters the room. I know that you saw the truth of what was happening before I did. I know that this house was silent for years until you both arrived. From her wheelchair, Amelia made a soft sound. Not quite a word, but clearly an attempt to join the conversation. All three adults turned to look at her. Ball, she said, pointing to Malik with a small smile. Malik grinned. That's me, he told the adults. She calls me Ball because of the toy car and the red ball. It's our special name. Richard felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the grief that had bound him for so long. In that moment, watching his daughter smile at the boy who had saved her, he saw not the family he had lost, but the one that was forming around him now, unexpected, unconventional, and infinitely precious. What do you think, Malik? He asked gently. Would you like to stay and help Amelia get better? Malik looked at Amelia, then at his mother, his expression serious beyond his years. She's my friend, he said simply. Friends don't leave. Ruth's eyes filled with tears as she nodded her agreement. Then it seems we're staying. Outside the window, the pool glimmered in the evening light, no longer a site of near tragedy, but the birthplace of a new beginning for all of them. Winter melted into spring, and spring blossomed into summer once more. The DeVoe mansion, once a monument to grief and isolation, had undergone a transformation as remarkable as Amelia's own. The sterile white walls had been painted in warm colors, the heavy curtains replaced with light, flowing fabrics that danced in the breeze. Medical equipment had been minimized, tucked discreetly into cabinets, or removed entirely as Amelia's strength grew. Most striking was the sound. Where silence had once reigned, the halls now echoed with laughter, conversation, and music. The East Wing, once forbidden territory, buzzed with activity as Ruth and Malik had made it their home, bringing with them the warmth and energy that had first awakened the sleeping house. On this particular morning, Amelia sat in the sunroom that had been converted into her therapy space. Large windows overlooked the pool and gardens, flooding the room with natural light. She no longer used the pink wheelchair, except on her most fatigued days. Instead, she sat on a specially designed chair that supported her improving posture, while allowing her the freedom to move. Before her stood an easel, and on it, a canvas awash in shades of blue. Her art therapist, Elena, had discovered Amelia's fascination with water early in her treatment. What began as simple finger painting had evolved into increasingly complex works as Amelia's fine motor skills improved. Today, she was working on her largest piece yet, a swirling underwater scene that captured the moment of her awakening. More turquoise, she said, her speech still halting but clearer with each passing week. For the light. Elena handed her the requested paint. Amelia's grip on the brush was awkward, but determined as she added highlights where sunlight would pierce the water's surface. Her movements were deliberate, each stroke a victory over the paralysis that had once imprisoned her. Malik burst into the room, his school day finished. At 9 years old now, he had grown an inch taller, but remained the same exuberant spirit who had first seen beyond Amelia's silence. Wow, he exclaimed, examining her painting. It looks just like being underwater, like that day. Amelia smiled at him, a full, genuine smile that had once seemed impossible. My memory, she confirmed. The painting was one of dozens that now lined the walls of what they had come to call The Blue Studio. Each canvas captured water in different forms. The pool where Amelia had first moved, ocean waves she had seen on their family trip to the coast, rain streaming down windows during storms. Water, which had awakened her body, now seemed to be awakening her artistic soul as well. Dr. Winters, who had initially feared the pool incident would end his career, had instead become a champion of Amelia's therapy after witnessing her progress. The sensory stimulation of painting, the textures, colors, movements, creates new neural pathways, he had explained to Richard. She's literally rebuilding her brain through art. But Richard knew it was more than science. The paintings weren't therapy exercises. They were Amelia's voice, telling the story she had been unable to share for so many years. In his study, Richard reviewed the quarterly report for the Amelia DeVoe Foundation. What had begun as a personal mission of atonement had quickly grown into one of the country's leading advocacy organizations for diagnostic reform in pediatric medicine. The foundation funded research into alternatives to heavy medication protocols for children with neurological differences, provided second opinion grants for families seeking additional evaluations, and offered legal support to those challenging misdiagnoses. Most significantly, the foundation had established a certification program for medical institutions, recognizing those that implemented whole child approaches that emphasized observation and connection over immediate pharmaceutical intervention. Hospitals across the country were now competing to earn what the medical community had dubbed the Amelia Standard. Richard closed the report, feeling a sense of purpose that had eluded him even in his most successful business years. His wealth, which had once seemed powerless against his daughter's condition, was now creating systemic change. Children who might have been sentenced to the same silent prison as Amelia were instead receiving treatments that honored their humanity and potential. The door to his study opened, and Ruth entered with a stack of RSVPs. "The response for the foundation gala is overwhelming," she said, placing the papers on his desk. "We'll need to move to the larger venue." Ruth had officially joined the foundation as its executive director 6 months earlier, bringing her practical wisdom and fierce advocacy to the role. Her background in hospital administration, combined with her personal experience as Malik's mother, made her uniquely qualified to bridge the worlds of medicine and family care. "And the guest of honor?" Richard asked. "How is she feeling about her speech?" Ruth smiled, nervous but determined. "She and her speech therapist have been practicing every day, and Malik has appointed himself her official coach, complete with a whistle he found somewhere." Richard laughed, a sound that had once been rare in the mansion, but was now commonplace. "Between the two of them, I have no doubt she'll be magnificent." The night of the gala arrived, transforming the grand ballroom of the city's finest hotel into a showcase for the foundation's work. Amelia's paintings lined the walls, each one paired with the story of a child who had benefited from the foundation's advocacy. Medical professionals mingled with families, politicians with philanthropists, all united by the mission to change how medicine approached children with complex neurological conditions. Richard stood backstage, adjusting his bow tie nervously. The past year had taught him that true courage had nothing to do with business deals or financial risks. It was standing beside your child as she faced her fears. It was admitting your mistakes publicly and working to correct them. "It's time," the event coordinator whispered, gesturing toward the stage. Richard nodded and stepped out to the podium, blinking against the bright lights. He delivered his brief introduction, highlighting the foundation's achievements and thanking those who had supported its mission. Then he paused, his voice softening. "A year ago, My daughter Amelia lived in silence. Today she has asked to speak to you herself. This will be her first public address, and it represents a journey that once seemed impossible. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my daughter, Amelia DeVoe. The side curtain parted, and a collective gasp rose from the audience. Amelia stood there in a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her dark hair framing a face that radiated determination. Beside her stood Malik in a suit that matched Richard's own, his hand supportively under her elbow. Together, they began the long walk across the stage, Amelia's steps slow but steady, each one a testament to months of grueling physical therapy. The audience held its breath as she navigated the distance to the podium, where a microphone had been adjusted to her height. Malik helped her position herself, then stepped back slightly, close enough to help if needed, but giving her the spotlight she had earned. Amelia gripped the edges of the podium, took a deep breath, and began to speak. 1 year ago, she said, her voice soft but clear, each word carefully formed, I was trapped, not just in my body, but in everyone's idea of who I was. She paused, gathering strength for the next sentence. The audience remained perfectly still, captivated. Doctors saw a diagnosis. Nurses saw a patient. Even my father. She turned slightly to smile at Richard. Saw a tragedy. But Malik... Her eyes found the boy standing proudly beside her. He didn't try to fix me. He just saw me. And that changed everything. Tears glistened in Richard's eyes as he watched his daughter speak words that had been locked inside her for so long. The audience listened in rapt silence as Amelia continued, describing her awakening in simple but powerful terms, explaining how it felt to be seen as a person rather than a condition. When she finished her short speech, the ballroom erupted in a standing ovation. Malik beamed beside her, and Richard stepped forward to embrace them both as cameras flashed, capturing the moment that would appear on the foundation's materials for years to come. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Richard found a quiet moment with Ruth in a corner of the ballroom. They watched as Amelia and Malik sat with a group of children from the Foundation's outreach program, Amelia patiently demonstrating a simple painting technique to a young girl in a wheelchair. She's remarkable, Ruth said softly. They both are. Richard nodded, his chest tight with emotion. I've been meaning to discuss something with you, he said. Something important. Ruth turned to him, her expression curious. The lawyers have drawn up the papers, he continued. If you're willing, I'd like to formalize what we've all known for months now. You've become more than Amelia's caretaker. You're the mother figure she's been missing since birth. Ruth's eyes widened. What exactly are you suggesting? Legal guardianship, Richard explained. Shared with me, of course, but official recognition of the role you already play in her life. And, for Malik, he hesitated. Legal status as her brother, if that's something you both would want. Ruth watched her son laughing with Amelia, their heads bent close together over the painting. Not adoption? She asked quietly. That would be my preference, Richard admitted. But I didn't want to presume. The guardianship papers can be a first step, with adoption as a possibility for the future, if that feels right to all of us. Tears filled Ruth's eyes. When I took that housekeeping job, I was just trying to keep a roof over our heads. I never imagined. None of us did, Richard said, his own voice thick with emotion. But sometimes the families we create are more powerful than the ones we're born into. Ruth nodded, unable to speak. Across the room, Malik had taken Amelia's hand, guiding her in a simple dance step as the orchestra played. They moved awkwardly but joyfully, Amelia's progress evident in every careful movement. "Yes," Ruth finally said. "Yes to guardianship. Yes to family. Yes to whatever comes next." Richard squeezed her hand in silent gratitude, both of them watching the children who had brought them together. One born to wealth, but imprisoned by misdiagnosis. The other born to struggle but carrying the key to freedom. Together, they had rewritten the story of what family could mean. The day after the gala, with the excitement still humming through the mansion, Amelia asked to visit the pool. It was a perfect summer afternoon, reminiscent of that fateful day a year earlier, when everything had changed. Richard watched from the patio as Amelia made her way carefully down the stone path, using her cane for balance, but walking independently. Her progress continued to astonish her doctors, though Malik had never doubted it for a moment. The boy walked beside her, chattering about the gala, the food, the people who had asked for his autograph after hearing Amelia's speech. He had grown into his role as her protector and companion, with a natural grace that belied his young age. They reached the pool's edge, the same spot where Malik had once made his reckless, miraculous decision. Amelia lowered herself carefully to sit at the edge, letting her feet dangle in the water. Malik joined her, their reflections wavering in the gentle ripples. "Remember when I pushed you in?" Malik asked, his voice carrying across the water to where Richard sat. "I was scared after, but I knew it would help." Amelia nodded. "You saw the water in my eyes," she said, her speech deliberate but clear. "No one else noticed." "I brought something," Malik said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small red rubber ball, identical to the one Amelia had first held in the hospital, the object that had inspired her first word. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "For remembering," he explained. Amelia looked down at the ball, then back at Malik. A smile spread across her face, not the hesitant, partial expression of her early recovery, but a full, radiant smile that transformed her features. "Ball," she said clearly, then laughed, a sound that had once seemed impossible, but now rang out across the water like music. She tossed the ball into the pool with surprising accuracy. It landed with a splash and bobbed on the surface between them. "Race you!" Malik challenged, sliding into the water. Amelia looked toward her father, seeking permission. Richard nodded, his heart in his throat, as she carefully lowered herself into the pool. The water embraced her, supporting her weight, allowing her a freedom of movement she couldn't yet achieve on land. With slow but determined strokes, she moved toward the floating ball, Malik swimming beside her, not helping, just accompanying. When she reached it, her fingers closed around it triumphantly. Richard watched them from the patio, the scene before him a living testament to how completely their world had changed. Ruth joined him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder as they observed the children playing in the water that had once been the site of such fear and then such miracle. The DeVoe mansion stood behind them, its windows open to the summer breeze, its rooms filled with artwork, therapy equipment, toys, and the everyday evidence of lives being fully lived. The silence that had once pressed down like a weight had been banished by laughter, conversation, music, and the occasional argument, all the beautiful noise of family. As the sun began its descent, painting the water in shades of gold that matched Amelia's most recent canvas, Richard realized that the true transformation wasn't in the medical breakthroughs or even in Amelia's remarkable progress. It was in the recognition that healing begins not with science or wealth, but with being truly seen. The mansion that had once drowned in silence now overflowed with life. Proof that miracles begin where love dares to break the rules.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.